Chapter 7 of The Alley Cat's Kitten. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Alley Cat's Kitten by Carolyn Fuller. Chapter 7. The Family in the Piano Box. When Franklin went out into the yard on his birthday morning, he stopped and stared very hard at something that had never been there before. It was a piano box, with an open space fenced off at one side, and a square hole leading into it, and at the end of the box was a real door, high enough for a boy to use. "Why, where—" Franklin began, and then he heard a shout of laughter from Eunice and Bridget and Kenneth, who were watching him from the shed. Mrs. Wood was there too, smiling at his astonishment. "They're chickens," she explained. "Grandmother thought you didn't spend enough time out of doors." "When did they come?" Franklin asked. "Last night, and the house was built yesterday while you were over at Fred's. That's Grandma's present, too." "Well, I'll be thunderstruck!" Franklin exclaimed. "Oh, I say, what a bully padlock! Isn't Grandma a brick? Are they in there now?" "Go and see," said his mother, handing him the key. Franklin unlocked the door with shining eyes and a new feeling of importance. There was money in chickens, everybody said. A fine young rooster was standing, solemnly, in his pan of food, surrounded by 5 admiring wives, who cocked their heads at Franklin as he approached. "Plymouth Rocks!" he explained. "Oh, Mother, these are first-rate chickens!" "Let them out," Mrs. Wood called. "The little door lifts up." Franklin opened the door, and the fowls strutted out in thoughtful procession, winking their lemon-colored eyes at the sun. Then the rooster drew a long breath, raised his head to an alarming height, and, after several attempts, indulged in a strange sound which he had evidently planned for a crow. His wives all looked impressed, but Franklin laughed, and Eunice, who came running out in her coat and pussy hood, asked, "Oh, Franklin, is that poor hen sick?" Mrs. Wood and Kenneth came out too, and discussed names for the new arrivals. "They ought to have colonial titles," Mrs. Wood said, "but I can't think of anything but Praise God Barebones, and that wouldn't be handy to call one by." "There was John Alden, Mother," Franklin suggested. "Why, of course, and Priscilla and Rose Standish." "And Columbus," added Kenneth with pride. "They don't all need to be Puritans," Franklin said. "I'd rather have some of them more modern. Just see that one there with the extra ruffle on her comb. I'm going to call her Vietra Peck. And the stiff one that does stunts with her toes every time she puts 'em down. Doesn't she walk like Miss Hannah Wakefield? I'm going to call her Hannah." "Hannah Squawk," Eunice said. "That's a pretty name." "Uncle Edward sent word that he'll pay 5 cents apiece for eggs when your hens begin laying," Mrs. Wood said. "He always liked a boiled egg for his breakfast and can never be sure that the store eggs are perfectly fresh." Franklin was delighted and went up that evening to talk business with Mr. Bates. His uncle said that he knew of still another gentleman who would pay as much for fresh eggs. Indeed, he and this man had become acquainted through sharing a bad egg at a restaurant. They said that nothing made people such good friends as having a common enemy. But Franklin's hens did not begin to lay until March, and then they seemed to have no ideas at all about the proper place for eggs. Franklin found them on the hen-house floor and out in the yard, and very often they were broken. One hen persisted in laying what Eunice called soft-boiled eggs, those without a shell, until Franklin put crushed oyster shells in her food, and then she laid ordinary Easter eggs like the others. Somebody gave Eunice a bantam named Flossie, who laid cunning little white eggs like marshmallows, which Eunice had for her breakfast. Franklin received enough from the sale of the eggs to buy wheat screenings and other food for his birds, as he called them, but he made nothing more, and soon began to feel the disadvantage of owning such idiotic pets. "They never reason about anything," he complained, "and they haven't any sense of humor. They can't see a joke even when it's on them." "I don't like 'em," Kenneth said. "They're not warm and cuddly like Weegems or funny like Cyclone. They're not much different from what they are fricasseed, except for the gravy." Soon after the hens began to lay, they showed a desire to sit. So Franklin bought a dozen grocery store eggs for Viatra Peck, but he had to move her into the woodshed because all the other hens tried to sit at the same time in Viatra's box. He felt rather surprised and grieved that Viatra should stop laying while she sat, but said, "I suppose she thinks she laid all those grocery store eggs and feel that she's done enough." He waited until Viatra had sat for a week, and then a fit of impatience seized him. "I don't believe all those eggs are good," he announced at breakfast one day. "It isn't time for them to be out yet," his mother said. "Yes, I know, but Viatra ought not to be wasting her strength hatching bad eggs. I'm just going to investigate a little and see how they're coming on. Of course, you know that if you do that, it will kill the chickens." "Not the way I've thought of." And that day after school the way was carried into effect. Franklin chipped a little hole in each cell and pasted court plaster over the hole in those eggs that contained chickens. The others he threw away, and was quite triumphant to find that there were only 7 good eggs out of the dozen. "You see," he told his mother, "it would have been such a pity for Viatra to sit another whole week on something that was never meant for anything but an omelet." Mrs. Wood never expected the chickens to hatch, but they did, every one of them. This is a true story, and grew up to be exactly the kind of chickens that one would expect from the grocery store eggs. They were none of them brothers and sisters, or even distant cousins, and all seemed like dreadfully ordinary fowls. But Franklin enjoyed them all the more, because each one that came out was such a surprise. He rose at 5 o'clock in the morning when the first was due, and stole downstairs in his nightgown to feel under the hen. She responded with her usual angry squawk, but at the same time he heard a little soft, sweet sound like the note of a bird, and drew forth a mouse-colored ball of down that looked at him confidingly out of round baby eyes. "Say, you're the fellow I came to meet," Franklin said, setting the thing on its tiny feet, and he mixed some cornmeal mush for it, which Viatra ate up immediately. After breakfast there were 2 more chickens, and before night the whole 7 were cuddled under Viatra's wing. "What's that on the back of the stove?" asked Biddy the next morning as Eunice came into the kitchen. "Oh, that's my incubator with an egg in it. I am going to have some chickens, too." The incubator was an old candy box stuffed with cotton and hung on top of the range. "When it hatches, you can have my best bonnet to raise it in," said Biddy, disrespectfully, but she was never called upon to keep her promise, for the egg baked hard on the next washing day, and Eunice ate it. Franklin set Hannah on some homemade eggs, but she used to leave them to fly at the cats, and none of them hatched but an egg of Flossie's, which was named Fairy Lillian. She afterwards grew up to be an enormous white rooster with shaggy legs and a great deal of manner. When the warm weather came, the cats were fed in the yard, and as the chickens were always escaping from their own quarters, there were many pitched battles over the food. The hens stole things from the kittens and pecked them cruelly when they tried to interfere. Once Eunice saw John Alden seize a whole mutton chop bone and hurry around the house with it, followed by all the cats. It seemed too unfair, and Eunice wrote a note to Franklin that day about it in school. "Dear Franklin, I hate your hens. Your loving sister, Eunice." But the next day something happened that cured John Alden forever of imposing upon those weaker than himself. He noticed a strange cat taking dinner with the others, and thought, here's the chance for me. The natural shyness of this visitor will prevent him from resenting my intrusion. And, with a haughty stride, he landed in their midst. The strange cat looked up, planted one paw firmly on the piece of fried potato he was eating, and clawed out one of Johnny's eyes. The assault was so unexpected that Johnny could only stagger one-sidedly away and sit down in the drinking pan to recover his balance. He knew that no hen could ever admire him again, and that the slowest caterpillar would be able to evade his peck. It was terrible. Fortunately, Biddy had seen the attack from the window and was able to testify that none of the family cats had done it. "It was a cat with a nose that disgraced the hiving he sat under," she said. "But oh, the splendid fight in him! He was like a defender of innocence." Eunice was sorry for Johnny, but felt that her cats had been avenged, and stole out that evening to make friends with the defender of innocence. He was skulking under a neighbor's barn and peered out at her with unfriendly, suspicious eyes set in scratched lids. Eunice had seen Thomas cats before, those with broad, bland noses who sit out in front of fish shops and have self-respect, but she had never met such a cat as this. "He doesn't seem to like me," she thought, feeling rather hurt. "Come, poor kitty, and get some milk." But at this point the barn cat screwed up his torn nose with a peculiarly threatened effect and gave one long, slow spit, most terrible to hear and behold. Eunice dropped her saucer of milk and fled. She had not supposed that she would ever live to hear a cat speak to her like that. He did not call on Weegems after this, except at night, when everybody else was in bed. And Eunice wrote a song about him that she and Kenneth used to sing as a duet. Sometimes one took the alto part and sometimes the other, but in any case the cat always fled. He told Weegems that it was because it made him feel so hollow. "I hear the voice of a poor, poor cat. His voice is thin as a thin, thin slat. I fear his stomach is just like that, an empty place in the poor, poor cat." But one night, Torn Nose relieved his emptiness by eating one of the Atripex's chickens. "I'll shoot that old barn cat, you see if I don't," Franklin said furiously. But Mrs. Wood said that it would mean one less chicken for her to chase. To tell the truth, she was getting rather tired of them, for every day, while Franklin was at school, they caused misunderstandings with the neighbors. "If they'd only wait till he gets home," she said, "but they commit all their worst outrages in the morning." No sooner would she sit down to her sewing than there would come a polite ring at the doorbell, and a certain Mr. Teachout would say, "Pardon me, madam, but your fowls are trespassing on my strawberry beds." And Mrs. Wood would apologize and hasten forth to drive the fowls from their unlawful picnic grounds. But she would scarcely have returned to the sitting room before there would be a thundering knock at the back door, and she would hear Biddy's voice raised in an irate argument with the woman across the alley. "You just tell your missus if she don't keep them chickens out of my cabbages, I'll wring their necks." Then poor missus would have to run out in the hot sun again and jump cabbages until her unruly brood had been persuaded to return. "I couldn't take but 3 cabbages in one leap at first," she told Franklin, "but now," she added proudly, "I can do 5. She knew that her son admired an athletic woman and talked a great deal among the boys about having the only mother who could drive a nail straight. But when Franklin spoke of wanting a boat at the lake that summer, she said that he could not possibly afford to have one unless he sold his chickens. "But, Mother, I'm not going to buy the whole boat. Our share will only come to about $13. "I don't think we ought to afford even half a boat unless you sell the chickens. Nobody loves them anyhow. It isn't fair, as if they were real folks like the cats." Franklin thought it over, and decided that, as he made no money from his hens, it might be as well to get rid of them. It was true also, as his mother had said, that nobody had loved them. But then they were not in the least demonstrative themselves, and did not seem to require affection. Indeed, their reserve amounted almost to coldness when any advances were made. And, in addition to this, they had once caused Franklin to appear quite foolish in school. He had kept a little diary of their doings labeled Plymouth Rock Record. And one day it happened to be on his desk when the principal came by. She picked it up with much pride, thinking that here was a boy who really loved his United States history, and, turning to the first entry, read, "Priscilla laid a hard-boiled egg today." Franklin wondered why it was that she left the room so suddenly, but suspected afterwards that she had been laughing at him. There's something silly about hens, he thought, no matter what they do. If you own them, you get drawn into it. He also told his mother that they were no good to photograph. "You mean they won't pose?" she asked. "Oh, it isn't that. They'll pose if you tie their legs, but they haven't any front view to their faces, only a right and a wrong side." A few days later, when Mrs. Wood was coming up the street, she saw people stop in front of her house, look down at their feet, and then go off laughing. She hurried home and found this sign tacked in the middle of the sidewalk. "For sale, one large, handsome Plymouth Rock rooster and his fine family of laying hens. Cheap. Inquire within." Also, one pretty playful kitten, Nice pet for ladies and children, thrown in. Mrs. Wood took up the notice and went in to tell Franklin that his cousins, Mary and Wyman Bates, had offered to buy his hens. She had been calling on their mother that afternoon, who said that the family had decided to raise their own fresh eggs and would be delighted to begin with chickens who were, in a way, related to them. So the next day Mary and Wyman came down with their man in a cart and took off most of the hens. John Alden did not go because, at the last minute, Franklin decided that he could not part with him, and Wyman himself admitted that he would quite as soon have a rooster with the usual number of eyes. Eunice's bantam Flossie also remained to keep Johnny company, and as he was very fond of her, he never missed his other wives at all, or if he did, he never mentioned it. And as Johnny had always been such a staid, gentlemanly old bird, Mrs. Wood went to bed that night feeling that all her troubles were over. But she did not know him. End of chapter 7.